Well, it's been an interesting day so far. I built tools for a fellow this morning and got a bunch of stuff on the porch in the mail. One of which is this box right here. What might this be? What this is the Farmertec 372 or 365. I'm not sure which just yet. So first we're going to do is take this apart and see in fact what's in the box. And then second, maybe we'll stick part of it together as a video. But the real interesting thing today for me was one of the shops I do work for is also a gun shop, and hosted a presentation by the Howa folks. One of the guys whose reps Howa came up and laid all those things out on the table and then went through them, and I think I'm going to put that in this video. And my takeaway from all that was, I always knew Howa makes good guns, but they've really upped their game. And then they carry this line that came from Australia, and it's really nice. You're going to have to wait into the video to see what it is. So right off the bat, it's not a 365, it is a 372. So let's take a look at what comes, and starting out with this. It really doesn't look all that bad on the inside. It really doesn't. I see some spots down in there, and sometimes when I've seen that in the past, that's prelude to flaking plating. But I guess I've run enough of them now where, yeah, you just get used to seeing stuff like that and run them anyway and see if they last. So is it 50 or 52? It's a 50 millimeter top end. So it would be more in line with a 372 to 365. So this is what comes with that Huztl 372 box of parts, which I guess is enough to build a saw. And it starts out with a 50 millimeter top end, which looks, well, okay. First, I'm going to go and chuck this up and see whether or not I can get it to see whether or not it's off or not. Let me shut the camera off. Well, we can do better than that, but I think I'm going to leave it for now. That's good enough. So even though the lamb chops look like they're a little bit off, and they probably are, 4,000s run out. I can deal with that. I think in a future video we're going to tap one of those to 0, and I think you're going to find that it makes a big difference in how the saw runs, especially the vibration. Definitely something that we can improve on. You know, I kind of like having all this clutter on the table. It makes for a good optic, you know. Start with all this stuff laying around, then having it boil into a saw. And do I do it in one video real fast, or do I actually go through and show people the bits and pieces on how to do one of these? You know, there's a bunch of guys out there who are freaking experts. I'll let them do it. We're just going to run through it quickly and get some oil on these bearings. One thing I do highly recommend is you getting those bar studs in before you put the cases together. So what I'm going to do is get the crank on first, then I'm going to put those bar studs in, and highly recommend doing it in that order. Now, you can see you have to be careful that connecting rod doesn't get in behind the case when you start pulling. Remind me, somebody. Oh, you can't remind me because you're out there and I'm in here. And by the way, this is not a how-to video, so don't be giving me crap about what order of events I did and is there a theoretical better way. But you know, I like this kind of thing because this is completely impromptu. I had no plans whatsoever to do these things. this project in particular, but it just so happened they showed up. And impulsive as I am, by the way, you see that rectangle? Make sure that they go into the rectangle in the case there, oriented properly, because once they start getting pressed down into the case, those bar studs, they're a pain to move. Now what I would do is get a socket or a bushing. I mean, you could probably use the bushing that I use for pushing things together, you know. Once you get them kind of aligned properly, drive them right down in there. Ooh, that's interesting. One thing I just found out, and guys, this is something you're going to have to pay attention to. It's one of those locating pins did not have a through hole. Okay, this is an absolute must pay attention to. Okay? As supplied with the kit, one of these locating pins has got a through hole and one of them does not. You see it? This one here you can't put on that one because that one requires a screw to go through it. It has to be down here at the corner. Okay? So the locating pin, and I wish I had a big flashing sign I could put in the video, the one with a through hole has to go up here. So that's definitely different than OEM cases, okay? Not just the diameter, but also their philosophy. Let me go run some of these screws in. I'm not going to squeeze with them. Don't look at how I do this. This is not recommended. Go. That's 24 foot-pounds. It should be 26, but I don't trust this wrench. It's 25. That's good. I'll tell you right now, it's not very tight. So we're starting at 40 thousandths without a base gasket. Are you getting me, guys? Without a base gasket, you're at 40. I've always seen this as kind of outside the channel, but basically since this squish is that far off, the goal is to make that flange, instead of, let me get right down in there, 320, I want to make it 280. That's the goal. And that's about as close as you're going to get. Just as a little aside, when you're working on these 372s, oftentimes you see that little bump right there. That's how the base gasket goes on, just like that. And since this saw is going to come apart and go back together, at least the top end is for a little bit, I'm not going to 1194 it. I'm just going to use, a standard gasket and let the gasket do its job. That's got to be, might as well just drop that in there too. While we're here, just get stuff out of the way. It's not that this is the right order, it's just because I want them not to get lost. One of the things you got to do is make sure that the throttle cable casing is in the trigger where it's supposed to be. It likes to come out of there. So once we got anti-vibon grommet on, you can take the fuel line, stick it right through here, and throttle cable right through there. Alright, I cut them down. Let me get the short one in the piston first, preferably flywheel side. There we go. That damn thing is stiff, but it's in there now. And that's good. That means they've increased the quality of these darn things as well. Wipe the piston off. Get the... That ring's not coming out of there anytime soon. Very, very hard. Much, much better than before. So that's another thing I've seen as an improvement on this series of parts. Just those little clips alone are better than what I've seen in the past. The crank looks better. The piston looks pretty nice. Those little clips, even though I cut those off, I think they're a better, certainly better than some I've seen in the past from them. Let me get the intake on, all that stuff. And then we'll set that top end right on there. Now they have a crank. Interestingly enough, they don't have those little rubber tabs and the rubber casting quite right yet. Because on OEM, this rubber edge is supposed to go right to that ridge, and this is supposed to go over the casting bump. And these really don't. So you just sort of have to line it up so it's fairly straight. You know, I think it's more important to have that parallel to the base than anything else. The rest of it's not quite on, but it's not quite off. It's not like that Groupon ad where it's 100% on. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that ad, but it makes me laugh. I can't remember her name, but she's a comedian. She's funny as hell. This depth here isn't quite deep enough to go all the way back to here, the way OEM would. I'm going to chicken out and 1184 it. One thing I would suggest is get a little bit of oil on the inside of these ring compressors. This is where the shenanigans start. Again, this falls into the category of what I do, and everybody can do it their own freaking way. I don't care. As I stick that right through now. Alright, and then I kind of drop a couple of the cylinder screws in where I can get the gasket lined up properly. Of course, if I'm using 1194, That gasket is glued. The reason I'm not going to 1184 this cylinder base is because I know the top end is coming off. Probably multiple times. Because I now have a toy 372. One that doesn't matter. And that just gives me so much latitude to play with the cylinder and things and try different cylinders. While it's still up, I'm going to take the throttle cable, set it in there, and just kind of engage it again so it'll stay put. Here's our first issue. I'm going to back off that clamp some. Maybe that'll help. See, the boot doesn't fit quite right, and that's going to create some problems. And not quite sure how I'm going to do that, but I have to go and push that boot back, because otherwise it's not going to settle down in there. So that's the first issue I'm seeing with the kit, is since you can't push the boot far enough on where it sits down into that plastic tray. That is the only issue I've seen so far with these parts. Is that right there? Is that boot not going back far enough? And I'm afraid it's just going to have to be like that. There it goes. Okay, well, you are able to push it in, but it takes a substantial amount of effort. Well, let me wind those screws right down. Pulse line does work. Get the pulse line on the carburetor. Get the fuel line. Now I would cut that just a little bit. Okay, had run out of batteries. Probably good. Didn't realize it until I was pretty close to being done. And just as well, kind of went through some boring standard assembly. For example, the chain brake and stuff like that. Buck and spike. Chain brake paddle. Ignition. Pull start. Cover. I think this is a good point to cover a couple of first impressions. It's actually not a bad offering. It really isn't. It looks to me, without running it, we're going to have to find out how it runs. There's a lot of serviceable parts in here, which is really, to me, the goal, not so much the full saw, to see whether or not some of these will translate to repair part options for 372s, especially the ones that get crushed and beat up. I've used that plastic for quite some time, same with the tank, on some other saws, and I know they're pretty good. That's good stuff. The internals, the crank, the bearings, and the seals, I don't know. We'll see. My first impression when I looked at that crank was, maybe. But when I looked at it and measured it, yeah, it's out a little bit, but not terribly so. The cases, and this is a very important point, you cannot mix case halves with OEM because the locating pins are different. Things like the screws being chromed versus black and stuff like that. You know, I don't know. Does that matter? It might. It doesn't stand out as an issue to me, just as something you kind of have. Parts like that muffler I've used for several years, just like that. These are serviceable parts. The one thing about the muffler that you have to know is it does not have a spark arrestor, and if you're working in places where that's required, you don't want to use those. If we're working around your yard, it's probably not as critical. I use them because they make good performance for a get-together saw, you know, for a guy just to bolt on a muffler and make it run a little bit better. On your standard 365s, that's not a bad option. I don't know about this handle yet. It looks like it's made from the same material that the ones I had on the 660s, which were a little bit soft. So the jury's out on the handle. So overall, I'm, you know, cautiously optimistic. This is a nice option. Now, there are some parts that they're not going to last on my saw very long. If you notice, there's an alignment issue. And that's because of the anti-vibe springs. In particular, I believe that one. It does not wind in straight. Just the whole design is just a little bit off. So that's one part. I'm not sure if there's going to be other of those anti-vibe spring that I eventually replace, but that one's got to go. That's not an acceptable solution right there. It could be that spring, or it could be actually the hole location on the handle. But something is off and the saw does not line up properly. Is that a big deal? I don't know. I don't know if it's a big deal. It's an annoyance. I'm not sure it's a buy-sell issue. It's something pretty easy to solve, I believe. It may require both the anti-vibe spring and the handle. That's something I'll evaluate over time. The other issue I have is, and I think I mentioned it in the body of the video, is the intake boot. And what the problem is, the distance that you can push that intake boot onto the flange for the intake manifold, they don't have that dimensionally correct. Basically how far it goes onto the cylinder. It doesn't go far enough. They kind of got that part of the intake boot not designed properly. And what happens is, since it's held out just a little bit, that rubber dam doesn't quite fit properly into the case, and also the cover doesn't fit that properly. And the material of the intake boot itself seems to me like it's going to be on the brittle side, especially when it gets cold. So right off the top, if I was going to really build this saw for real, I would probably get the OEM anti-vibe springs, handle, and intake boot. That's what I see right now, those three items. The carburetor, I don't know. It may be fine. I've heard good and bad about the carburetors. The plating in that cylinder had me a little bit nervous, so I guess that's the fourth issue. So to this point in time, I've actually got 5 issues. And anti-vibe springs, like I said, handle, like I said, intake boot, like I said, the case having the different size locating pins, and the plating on the cylinder. Did I say intake boot? I'll say it again. No spark arrestor on the muffler. That's a potential issue. I'm just raising these as issues. And the last one is you really need to have that little O-ring gasket. I'll get one out and I'll put it on this saw, and I'll put the part number up so you can see it. So it's the Husqvarna part number 5032630-19. It's this right here. That little thing. You really got to get one of those. They're cheap, but it's worth doing. Final comment. Fit and finish. Most of the stuff went right together. I really didn't have a problem with anything. The look and feel is not quite OEM. That does not mean they won't function perfectly well for a period of time. Things like that plastic cover right there and the chain brake parts. You know, they seem to work. My first concern about the chain brake band not having the pin turned out to be false. You just got to look through the parts to find that little pin that was in there. I wasn't thrilled with this oil line. It's a little bit, I don't know, the rubber's a little harder than I like. I guess we'll see how that plays out over time as well. So, I mean, there's some little concerns, but as a package as a whole, I'm cautiously optimistic that this is going to be, like the 660s, a useful and viable opportunity for a saw hobbyist to build their own, and actually have a useful saw at the end. We will see. We will see how long that cylinder lasts. I think the other thing is, just like with the 660s, the price point of these is such that really, who cares, And I've said this over and over and over and over. When you get into something like this and try to compare it to OEM quality saws or OEM saws, that's really not a fair comparison. What's a better comparison is this versus a price point saw that's in the same kind of ballpark numbers wise. For example, if you've got $300, $400 into this, what else can you get for $400? That's a more useful comparison than trying to say, oh, it's junk because it doesn't run like an OEM 372X torque. Well, we're going to find out. And I'm going to say a couple things right here that are probably going to cause me a little bit of grief. I did use Huztl bearings and seals in the first Huztl saw. That was back, my God, 2014 time frame, maybe 13, and that saw's still running. So some of those, and the top end, it was a big bore top end, but that saw has proven the test of time. This is where I get into trouble. It has outlasted some of the OEM X torques. All right. Could it be a statistical anomaly? Yeah. I'm not saying that these are going to outlast OEM X torques. I'm saying that that particular saw that was built on Husqvarna cases with a Husqvarna crank, but had Huztl Farmertec bearings, seals, piston, and cylinder, although it had OEM carburetor. But it did have the early version of the Huztl tank, which wasn't nearly as good as this one, by the way. That saw is still out there cutting wood, guys, So we get into this whole discussion about perception of quality. I've got a lot of saws I want to run. None of them get run enough. So usually what happens when I build something like this for test is it goes to one of my logger friends and let them just kill it, and then we can find out how it stands up to the other offerings they have. By the way, an update on the 660s. Guess what? They're still out there going. The ones we built last fall, after the cylinder that killed 2 cases in a row and kind of soured me on all these aftermarkets unfairly because it was an anomaly. The ones we built subsequent to that, using mostly Farmertec top end parts, one of them has a highway pop-up piston. They're still out there cutting wood, doing just fine. Well, the kill switch doesn't work. So we have another part. So, summary. Definitely going to need an intake boot. That's not going to last. So that's 1. Kill switch doesn't work. That's 2. The little O-ring that goes underneath there is 3. Anti-vibe spring is 4 for sure. Okay. This pull start started not wanting to retract. And I don't know if that's going to be a trend or was it just a fluke. The plating on that cylinder is suspect, but we'll see how that goes. And no spark arrestor on the muffler. Again, it depends on what your use is, but common sense says it's a good idea for most people to have a spark arrestor on the muffler. I'm a little suspect of the material on that handle, but we'll see. It runs. It'll cut wood the way it is right now. We're going to have to develop this, I think, as we had done the 660. And I can see from this first few minutes of running that it's going to be a good running saw. You know. Now remember that cylinder, I had to trim it a little bit because the squish was just way, way, way out of whack. What I'm saying is, like the 660s, these have potential, but are going to require some development to make it what I would consider a useful work saw. How's that? That's my summary. But the initial impressions are, there's a lot of potential here, I think. Well, of course, it's based on a really, really solid design, just like the 660s were. The 372s are among my favorite saws. See how that's out of alignment versus here. And that switch not working is a little bit of a pain for me. I don't like that. Well, let me just put it together, and it's going to have to go on the back burner for a little bit because I've just got a lot. Yeah, I would do something different there. I'm not really a fan of those. Not sure when I'm going to have time to put this thing in the wood. And just remember, this is not a Husqvarna. There's not a part on here yet. That's Husqvarna. It's a series of aftermarket parts, a lot of which are very, very viable repair parts. You know, when those 372s get to the point of, you know, to when those older 372s get past their service life, you can probably extend them with a lot of these parts. But I can't think of a better way of testing all those parts than building a saw with them and then just seeing what works and what doesn't over time. So I think I'm going to close this video off. I've got lots and lots and lots of hours of time to pick through to come up with an overview video for the first impression of a 372 kit saw.